At 35,000 feet above the Chongchon River on the morning of the 17th of December, 1950, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton banked his F-86 Alpha Sabre into a shallow pursuit curve and watched two MiG-fifteens trace their contrails south through the overcast far below him. They were flying at 22,000 feet. Neither pilot had looked up. Neither had reason to. 6 weeks earlier, on the 1st of November, 1950, MiG-fifteens had crossed the Yalu River from Manchuria and attacked a formation of United States Air Force B-29s with a speed and ferocity that no American pilot in theater had encountered since the final months above Germany. The reports reaching 5th Air Force headquarters in Japan described an aircraft that should not have existed. A swept-wing single-seat jet fighter with a service ceiling exceeding 50,000 feet, a maximum speed of approximately 668 miles per hour at altitude, and a cannon battery capable of dismantling a 60-ton Superfortress in a 2-second firing pass. Nothing in the United Nations command order of battle could chase it. The straight-wing Lockheed F-eighty Shooting Stars scrambled to intercept were 50 to 70 miles per hour slower in level flight, and the gap widened with altitude. The MiG pilots knew this. They hit and climbed back across the river into Chinese airspace before the interceptors could close range. The air war above northwestern Korea, which American forces had owned without meaningful challenge since the spring, had changed in an afternoon. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. The aircraft that had broken American air superiority over Korea was the MiG-15, a swept-wing fighter whose existence Western intelligence had tracked with deepening concern since its first public appearance at a Toshino Air Display in 1947. It was compact, 33 feet long, with a wingspan of just over 33 feet, and its weight had been kept deliberately low by stripping out every system its designers considered expendable. Maximum takeoff weight of 11,732 pounds. Its Klimov VK-1 engine, producing 5,950 pounds of thrust at sea level, was not a Soviet design. It was a licensed reproduction of a Rolls-Royce Nene, a consequence of the British government's decision in 1946 to sell Moscow the right to manufacture one of the finest turbojets then in existence, a commercial transaction that would cost American pilots blood over the next 3 years. Combined with a 35-degree wing sweep, the engine gave the MiG a service ceiling of approximately 50,900 feet, a rate of climb at sea level approaching 3,500 feet per minute, and handling characteristics at altitude that nothing then flying in the United Nations inventory could match. Its armament was not designed for dueling. One 37mm Nuttleman In-37 cannon carried 40 rounds. Two 23mm Nuttleman Chernov NS-23 cannon carried 80 rounds each. They were bomber-killing weapons, designed to destroy large, slow aircraft with the smallest possible expenditure of ammunition. A 2-second burst from the 37mm could split a wing spar. The B-29s attacked over the Yalu in November fell apart before their gunners could adequately return fire. The men in the cockpits of those MiGs were not North Korean pilots. The official position, maintained by Pyongyang for decades, repeated in Western newspapers, and never directly challenged by Washington, was that the People's Air Force of the Korean People's Army flew the MiG-fifteens engaging United Nations aircraft over northwestern Korea. The actual position was different and could not be acknowledged without risking an escalation that neither government was prepared to manage. The Soviet Air Force's 64th Fighter Aviation Corps had deployed to Manchurian bases at Antung and Tatunko in the autumn of 1950. The pilots they sent were among the most combat-experienced aviators in the Soviet arsenal. Men who had flown against the Luftwaffe for 4 years on the Eastern Front and spent the years since absorbing every lesson that war had generated. When they flew combat missions over North Korea, they wore Chinese flight suits, carried no identification documents, and operated under strict instructions not to fly south of the Pyongyang-Wonsan line, a boundary calculated to prevent capture and the diplomatic incident that would follow. They also communicated in Russian, a fact noted within weeks by American radio intercept operators monitoring the tactical frequencies from positions in Japan and over the Yellow Sea, and reported through intelligence channels to the highest levels of the administration without appearing in any newspaper. The decision to acknowledge that the United States Air Force was engaged in active combat with the Soviet Air Force was not a decision anyone in Washington was prepared to make that winter. So the war in the air above MiG Alley was fought on the understanding, unspoken but universally shared, that neither side would say out loud who was actually flying. What the Soviet pilots said in their own assessments of the F-86, once word reached Antung that it had arrived in Japan, has been partially reconstructed from Soviet Air Force documents declassified in the 1990s and from the post-war accounts of pilots, including Yevgeny Popeliev, who would become one of the highest-scoring Soviet aces of the conflict. The consensus in the first weeks of December was that the Sabre was a capable aircraft and not a fundamental threat to the MiG's operational position. The logic was straightforward and technically sound. The MiG could fly higher, where the Sabre's engine shed power and its controls grew less responsive. It could climb faster when the geometry of an engagement demanded escape. Its cannon outweighed the Sabre's 650 caliber machine guns at any range beyond close combat. And, crucially, the Sabre was forbidden from crossing the Yalu. An engagement going badly could be resolved in 30 seconds by turning north. The sanctuary was always available. The Soviet pilots at Antung read the F-86's specifications, noted the gaps, and concluded that the fundamental arithmetic of the air war had not changed with the Sabre's arrival. They would not have long to hold that position. The F-86 Alpha that General Earl Partridge's 5th Air Force rushed to Korea at the end of 1950 was not, on paper, a superior aircraft to the MiG-15. Its General Electric J-47 engine, and the Alpha variant, produced 5,200 pounds of thrust, 750 pounds less than the MiG's Klimov at sea level. Service ceiling, approximately 47,000 feet, nearly 4,000 below the MiG. Maximum speed at altitude, roughly comparable, though the comparison obscured as much as it revealed. Armament: 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns with 267 rounds per gun. Powerful weapons for attacking an aircraft whose fuel tanks lacked self-sealing protection, but substantially outweighed by the cannon battery on the other side of the engagement. What the comparison did not capture, what the Soviet technical assessments did not fully account for, was the A1CM lead computing gun sight. The A1CM was a gyroscopically stabilized device mounted in the F-86's cockpit that removed the most technically demanding variable in aerial gunnery from the pilot's cognitive burden. Against a crossing target, an aircraft moving laterally through the gun sight's field of view, a skilled pilot using an optical ring and bead sight had to estimate the target's angular velocity, compute the required lead angle in his head, and point his aircraft not at where the target was but at where it would be by the time his round arrived. This was the deflection shot, and it was genuinely difficult, and the Soviet pilots who flew to Korea were good at it. Several, tested against measured gunnery standards, were demonstrably better natural deflection shots than most of their American counterparts. The Luftwaffe had produced similar figures in its veterans, and the Soviet Air Force had learned from the same data. The A1CM removed the natural shot from the equation. A gyroscopic element within the sight measured the angular rate of change between the F-86 and its target, the rate at which the target was crossing the pilot's field of view, and automatically computed the deflection required to place the burst where the target would be, not where it was. A pilot who could hold the sight's reticle on the target aircraft for the 2 to 3 seconds required for the gyro to stabilize received, in return, a corrected aiming point that accounted for lead angle, target velocity, and the ballistic arc of the 50 caliber rounds. The pilot did not calculate. He held and fired. The gun sight did the mathematics that the Soviet pilots were doing in their heads. Against a target that a trained pilot could hold his sight on for 3 seconds, the A1CM was, in the language of the pilots who used it, close to certainty. The difficulty was holding the sight on the target for 3 seconds when the target was an aircraft capable of braking hard in any direction at closing speeds above 500 miles per hour. That required proximity. Proximity required patience and nerve. and patience and nerve were what Bruce Hinton brought with him to 35,000 feet on the 17th of December, 1950. He rolled out of his shallow descent at approximately 12,000 yards behind the trailing MiG of the pair below him and advanced his throttle to military power. The Sabre accelerated. He did not rush. He held the dive, holding the MiG in his sight picture without firing, counting the range down as the gap closed. 3,000 yards. 2,000. At approximately 1,000 yards, he settled his reticle on the wing root and held it there. The range was still closing. At around 600 yards, within the envelope where the A1CM's gyroscopic solution was stable, he squeezed the trigger. The burst struck the port wing root. The MiG went inverted and descended in an uncontrolled spiral that ended on the frozen ground near Sinuiju at 10 minutes past 10 in the morning. The first F-86 kill of the Korean War had required 11 minutes of patient positioning and 2 firing passes. The Soviet pilots at Antung received the intelligence summary within the week. Their assessment, as subsequently reconstructed from unit records reviewed by historians Robert Futrell and Xiaoming Zhang in decades of post-war research, was that the encounter represented an individual tactical failure and not a structural vulnerability. 1 kill and 1 engagement did not alter the MiG-15's sealing advantage, its armament advantage, or its ability to disengage across the Yalu at will. The fundamentals had not changed. They were right about the fundamentals. What they had not yet encountered was what happened to the fundamentals over the next 2 years in the hands of men who were developing, 1 engagement at a time, a doctrine for negating them. James Jabara arrived in Korea with the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing in the early months of 1951. He was 25 years old and 5 feet 6 inches tall, the son of Lebanese immigrants who had settled in Wichita, Kansas, and he had grown up with a fixation on aerial combat that preceded his first flight in a propeller-driven aircraft. He had flown P-51s in the final months of the European War and come home without a confirmed kill, the kind of outcome that matters to men who understand exactly what they are capable of and have not yet had the opportunity to demonstrate it. Korea was his second chance, and he understood that. His first 2 kills came in April of 1951, both confirmed by gun camera film, both MiG-15s caught at close range in the vertical plane. His 3rd and 4th followed within 2 weeks. By mid-May, the 4th wing had rotated most of its pilots home under the standard 100 mission limit, but Jabara had 4 kills and was 1 short of a distinction that no American had achieved in the jet age. Colonel John Meyer, commanding the 4th wing, a fighter pilot with 24 aerial victories from the European theater who understood what he was looking at, found administrative grounds to hold Jabara in theater. On the 20th of May, 1951, Jabara's flight intercepted a formation of approximately 50 MiGs above the Chongchon River. He went into the formation, held his gun sight reticle on the first target at 300 yards, a range that forced the I-1CM's gyroscopic element to stabilize almost instantly, and fired. The MiG disintegrated. The debris struck his Sabre and cracked a fuel line, which Jabara ignored. He found the second MiG already engaged with his wingman, close to 250 yards from his stern, placed his reticle, and fired. The MiG went down. He landed at Kimpo with 6 confirmed aerial victories and the distinction of being the first American jet ace in history. The Associated Press story filed that evening put his name on front pages across the United States by the following morning. What the newspaper accounts could not convey, because the Air Force did not characterize it that way, and Jabara himself was not inclined to elaborate, was the degree to which both kills had been a product of proximity and discipline rather than the instinctive deflection shooting that aerial combat instruction had traditionally emphasized. He had not outmaneuvered the MiGs. He had placed his aircraft close enough, with enough stability in his approach, that the gun sight solution was both clean and almost immediate. The gun sight had done the mathematics. Jabara had held the sight and pulled the trigger. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. The Soviet pilots who survived the 20th of May engagement debriefed their wing commanders and reported that the American had closed to reckless ranges. What they meant, without yet having the analytical framework to express it precisely, was that he had been effective in a way their current tactical model did not fully explain. The 64th Corps' response was to adjust its protocols, tighter formation discipline, greater altitude margins before committing, more aggressive use of a Yalu sanctuary when the geometry was uncertain. The MiG-15 remained the superior aircraft on every specification sheet that circulated through the Corps' intelligence chain. The tactical adjustments were refinements, not reconsiderations. The confidence in the MiG's fundamental dominance was not yet shaken. It would take a man from Texas and a man from Alabama to begin the process of shaking it. George Andrew Davis Jr. was 31 years old and had been flying combat since before Pearl Harbor. He had claimed 7 aerial victories against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific during World War II, flying P-40s and P-47s with the 5th Air Force. In Korea, assigned to the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, he had extended that total to 14 confirmed kills by the winter of 1951 and 1952, a number that made him the leading American ace in the Korean theater, and that meant, practically speaking, that his wing commander was in the position of managing an irreplaceable asset who showed every sign of wanting to remain irreplaceable by continuing to fly combat missions against the MiG. On the 10th of February, 1952, Davis led his flight north from Suwon into MiG Alley. His flight intercepted a large formation of Soviet MiG-15s flying escort for a group of ground attack aircraft heading south toward United Nations positions near Conakry. The MiG escort had the altitude advantage. Davis looked at the geometry and made a decision that his wingman would spend the rest of his life describing to anyone who would listen. He turned directly into the escort formation at a disadvantage of altitude and position, attacking because the ground forces below him would suffer if he did not, because the ground attack aircraft would reach their targets before his flight could establish a favorable position if he took the time to seek one. He shot down 2 MiGs in the first pass. Gun camera film confirmed both. He was maneuvering for a third when the trailing Soviet aircraft caught him. His F-86 was struck by cannon fire. Soviet Air Force records have never conclusively identified which pilot fired the fatal burst, and went down in a steep spiral at approximately 23,000 feet. No parachute was seen. Davis was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation described individual courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It could not note what the men who flew with him understood in the silence of the debrief room that afternoon. That Davis had surrendered his energy to protect the men on the ground, had broken the emerging doctrine of the air war. He was fighting in order to do his duty to the soldiers below it, and had paid the price that doctrine existed to prevent. He was a magnificent pilot who had made a decision that any honest accounting of the air war would have to call a tactical mistake, and he had made it for the best reason a man can have for breaking the rules of his profession. MiG Alley did not pause for Davis. The engagements continued, the after-action reports continued, and in the squadron briefing rooms at Kimpo and Suwon, a document was beginning to circulate that a pilot named Frederick Bless had spent most of the previous year writing in the margins of his operational notebook. Bless was flying his first combat tour with the 4th Wing when he began noticing, mission after mission, what the pilots who were killing MiGs were doing differently from the pilots who were coming home with gun camera film and no confirmed kills. He was methodical and precise in the way that effective combat pilots tend to be, and he was writing it all down. By the summer of 1952, the document ran to approximately 40 pages. Its informal title was No Gum Law, a phonetic rendering of a Korean expression for something beyond salvage. Bless meant it as a statement about the enemy pilot who had allowed his energy state to deteriorate past the point where the engagement could be recovered. The argument at the core of the document was not complicated. A fighter pilot's advantage was energy, the product of altitude and airspeed, and the pilot who preserved his energy while forcing his opponent to expend is held the decisive position in any aerial engagement regardless of the aircraft either man was flying. The MiG-15 would always have the ceiling advantage. It would always climb faster in the initial phase of an engagement. But the engagement did not have to be fought on the MiG's terms. A Sabre pilot who held his speed, maintained his altitude advantage, and refused to bleed energy in a turning fight at low speed was not, in Bless's framework, fighting a defensive action. He was denying the MiG the engagement geometry on which its advantages depended and waiting for the moment when the geometry shifted in his favor. When it did, when the MiG committed to a pass, when its pilot bled speed in a climbing turn that his engine could absorb, but that left him momentarily slow and predictable. The Sabre pilot with his A1CM gun sight had 30 seconds to exploit the solution before the moment closed. 30 seconds was enough. No Gumlaw was distributed through the 4th and 51st Fighter Interceptor wings in the autumn of 1952. Every pilot who could get a copy read it. The ones who read it most carefully were the ones still flying in October. What was about to happen above the Yalu in that autumn had been building for 2 years. The Soviet 64th Corps had adjusted its protocols in response to the Sabres' improving performance, ordering greater altitude margins before committing, restricting engagement to situations of clear numerical and geometric superiority, enforcing the discipline around the Yalu sanctuary. Their aircraft remained capable. Their pilots remained skilled. The MiG-fifteens' fundamental advantages, ceiling, climb rate, cannon weight, had not diminished. The technical assessments circulating through the Corps' intelligence chain still described the MiG as the structurally superior aircraft, which it remained. What the assessments had not yet fully modeled was what happened when a flight of F-86 Foxtrots, the newest production variant, with a water injection modification that boosted the J-47's thrust at altitude and an extended leading-edge configuration that improved high-altitude handling, entered the corridor from the south at combat speed, with Bless's principles internalized and Jabbar's lesson applied. What happened when American pilots who had read the document, who had flown the doctrine and found that it worked, found a large formation of MiG-fifteens at the 1 altitude and the 1 engagement angle where the MiG's technical advantages counted for the least and the A1CM's mathematical precision counted for the most. That morning was coming. The 45 minutes that would answer the question this story began with had not yet happened. They were about to. The morning that answered the question came on the 2nd of April, 1953, and it began the way most mornings in MiG Alley began, with radar plots from the Joint Operations Center at Taegu tracking formations assembling north of Yalu, and with telephone calls placed to flight operations at Kimpo and Suwon before the sun had fully cleared the ridgelines east of Seoul. The formations assembling at Antung and Tatunko that morning belonged to the 64th Corps and to the attached Chinese People's Volunteer Air Force units that had been feeding pilot rotations into the MiG Alley corridor since the autumn of 1951. The distinction between these two categories of pilots mattered enormously, though it was invisible from the air. The Soviet veterans in the Corps' frontline regiments were skilled, disciplined, and flying under strict operational protocols refined over 2 years of combat. The Chinese pilots rotated through the corridor for experience, against live opponents at live speeds, in the live geometry of an actual air war. Were at varying stages of their development, and the Soviet commanders at Antung knew this, and had built their employment doctrine accordingly. Chinese flights generally flew higher and in tighter formations than the Soviet veterans preferred. They were instructed to disengage early if the geometry turned against them. They were not expected to perform at the level of the men who had fought above Kursk and Kiev. They were expected to learn and to survive long enough for the learning to matter. On the 2nd of April, the formations that crossed the Yalu at altitude included a significant element of these Chinese pilots. The Soviet officers coordinating from Antung noted the weather, scattered high cloud at 40,000 feet. Visibility below that essentially unlimited, a thin layer of haze along the valley floors that would complicate cockpit visibility at lower altitudes for aircraft diving out of the sun. They noted the patrol patterns that 5th Air Force had been flying. They assigned their own flights their positions. The Chinese formations were told to hold above 40,000 feet until the geometry below them became clear. At Kimpo, the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing's morning brief had concluded. 16 F-86 Foxtrots were scheduled for the first combat patrol into the corridor. The Foxtrot was not the same aircraft that Bruce Hinton had flown on the 17th of December, 1950. The leading-edge slats of the earlier variants, a high-lift device that extended automatically at low speeds to improve handling at the edge of the stall, had been replaced in the Foxtrot with a fixed extended leading edge, a modification that surrendered some low-speed docility in exchange for a measurable improvement in the aircraft's turn performance at higher speeds. An F-86 Foxtrot in a hard turn at 30,000 feet and 450 knots was a different proposition than the aircraft the early Soviet assessments had characterized. The 64th Corps' technical analysts had noted the modification. They had not yet fully modeled what it meant at the altitudes and engagement angles where the morning's fighting would take place. The pilots at Kimpo, reading No Gum La, most of them had read it twice, had internalized the geometry argument. You held your speed. You did not turn with the MiG at low altitude. You did not sacrifice energy for position unless the position was decisive. You waited for the moment when the MiG's pilot, impatient or overconfident or pushed by his own doctrine into a pass he could not recover from cleanly, gave you the angle you needed. Then you put the reticle on and held it. Among the pilots taxiing to the runway at Kimpo that morning was Captain Joseph Christopher McConnell, Jr., flying with the 39th Fighter Interceptor Squadron of the 51st Wing, which had moved elements forward to Kimpo for the period of the spring offensive. McConnell was 27 years old and had arrived in Korea in late 1952 after years of navigating the Air Force bureaucracy toward a fighter assignment. He had been a navigator before he was a fighter pilot, a trajectory that had nearly redirected his career permanently, and he had fought his way into an F-86 cockpit through persistence and a demonstrated aptitude on the gunnery range that his instructors had not expected from a man who had spent his first years of military flying in the right seat of a transport. He had 11 confirmed kills. He was, on that morning, 1 kill behind Manuel Fernandez of the 4th Wing, who held the distinction of leading American ace in the current theater. McConnell knew the number. The men who flew with him knew he knew it, and they knew better than to mention it. The 51st Wing's 16 Sabres crossed the bomb line at 32,000 feet and turned northwest into the corridor at combat power. McConnell was leading his element of 4. He had briefed the engagement geometry at length the evening before. The specific approach angles that put the sun at the Sabres' backs and the MiG formation's cockpit visibility at its worst. The altitude bands where the Foxtrot's fixed leading edge delivered its best turn performance relative to the MiG's swept wing, the moment in the MiG's climbing break. The standard defensive maneuver when a Soviet or Chinese pilot saw a Sabre closing from behind, at which the MiG's speed bled fastest, and the A1CM solution was most stable. He had not lectured. He had drawn on the briefing board in chalk and asked questions until the men in front of him could describe it back to him without looking at the drawing. At 36,000 feet above the Chongchon, the radar controller aboard the airborne relay aircraft transmitted the contact. 2 large formations, one at approximately 42,000 feet, MiGs holding altitude, likely the Chinese element, and one at 38,000, tracking south. 16 aircraft, possibly more. McConnell checked his instruments. Fuel stayed adequate. Engine instruments in the green. He checked his gun sight reticle illumination and dimmed it slightly. The morning sun was behind him, and a bright reticle at altitude could make the fine adjustment before trigger squeeze harder than it needed to be. He checked his position relative to his wingman, Captain Dolph Overton, who was holding exactly where he should be, slightly high and 300 feet to the right. The formation was clean. The MiG-fifteens at 38,000 feet were at altitude, but not at the ceiling that their technical specifications allowed. This was the first item in the geometry that mattered. The second item was direction. They were tracking south on a heading of approximately 160 degrees, south-southeast, which put the sun precisely at the Sabres' backs and in the MiG pilot's eyes for the first critical seconds of any engagement from the western quarter. The third item was the formation structure. The 16 MiGs were flying in the stacked V pattern that Soviet doctrine had standardized for high-altitude patrol. Elements of 4 spaced vertically across a range of roughly 2,000 feet, with the highest element position to engage any Sabre flight that climbed to challenge the lower formation. It was sound doctrine designed to deny the Sabre the altitude advantage that no-gum law required. What it also did, in the morning light above the Chongchon, was produce a pattern that the radar operator aboard the relay aircraft could read clearly, in that McConnell, looking at his controller's transmission and the picture developing in his own canopy, could begin to assign engagement angles to before the MiG pilots had seen the Sabres at all. He came down from above into the west. Not a dive, a descending turn that preserved his airspeed, accelerating slightly as he came, so that when he arrived in the engagement envelope, he was approaching 500 knots with energy to spare. He had chosen the trailing MiG of the lowest element. A standard assignment under the Doctrine Bless had formalized. The trailing aircraft was the one whose lead wingman would have the most difficulty braking to protect, and the one whose departure from the formation would go unnoticed longest if the initial burst was silent enough that the gun camera flash was the only indicator. There was no radio call. The MiG's pilot did not turn. He was looking south along his formation's track, doing what the briefing had told him to do, maintaining position, monitoring his instruments, trusting the altitude above him to guard his back. The Sabre was behind him and below him, invisible against the pale winter haze of the valley floor 4 miles down, and it was closing a rate his rearward scan could not have detected even if he had been looking. At 1,200 yards, McConnell had the trailing MiG centered. He waited. 1,100 yards. He wanted the shot inside 800 yards where the A1CM's gyroscopic element was locked and stable, where the 50 caliber round arrived before the target's pilot had time to process that he had been fired at. 900 yards. He put the reticle on the wing root, held it there through the small oscillations of close-range formation turbulence, and squeezed the trigger at approximately 750 yards. The burst lasted 1.8 seconds. Gun camera film review that evening by the intelligence officer at Kimpo showed the first rounds entering the port fuselage aft of the engine intake, the second grouping striking the wing root, and the MiG beginning a slow, uncommanded roll to the left that the pilot never corrected. Whether he had been killed in the cockpit or incapacitated could not be established. The aircraft went left and down and did not come back. McConnell pulled up through the debris and pushed his throttle to full military power. What followed in the next 38 minutes has been reconstructed from gun camera film, from the after-action reports filed by 11 pilots of the 51st Wing, from the radar tracks logged by the Joint Operations Center at Taegu, and from the Soviet 64th Corps records reviewed by historians including Xiaoming Zhang in his authoritative work on the Chinese and Soviet air war over Korea. The reconstruction is not without gaps. The chaos of a 16 versus 16 engagement at 35,000 feet does not lend itself to clean chronological accounting. What the records agree on is the sequence and the arithmetic. The formation broke when the first MiG fell. The Soviet element leaders, there were Soviet pilots in this formation, distributed among the Chinese, transmitted the break call, and 16 cockpits became 16 individual problems simultaneously. Pilots who had been holding position instinctively pushed their throttles and broke in the direction their doctrine specified. Up and into the sun when possible, hard left or right when the geometry denied the climb. Some of the brakes were good, some were not. A pilot who brakes hard under energy is a pilot who is spending his advantage. A Sabre pilot who has held his energy through the patience that Bless had described, who arrives at the engagement with altitude and airspeed intact, can follow a braking MiG through the first 90 degrees of its turn without losing the geometry he needs. Not through the full 180 degrees. The MiG, at its best, turned harder than the Sabre could track if the MiG's pilot held his speed. But the best of the MiG's turn required speed to sustain, and a pilot who had not seen the attack coming was a pilot who had already flinched, who had put his nose down to accelerate before pulling it up to climb, who had spent 2 seconds processing and reacting before his hands moved. 2 seconds at the point of brake was the difference between a turn the Sabre could not follow and a turn that opened the solution angle just enough. McConnell found the second MiG at 29,000 feet in a climbing left brake, decelerating through the peak of its pull. He did not climb to match it. He let it come over the top and settle into its dive, waited for the speed to build back, and rolled in from the outside of the turn. The MiG's pilot saw him, The canopy showed the flash of sun on metal as it turned, and broke again, this time hard right, pushing down into the haze. McConnell followed. He had the energy. He held the reticle on the fuselage through the right bank, through the oscillation at the peak of the turn, and the gyro stabilized at 580 yards. He fired. 1.4 seconds. The MiG's engine blew. It went straight in. Around him, at altitudes between 28 and 36,000 feet, 7 other engagements were running simultaneously. Captain Harold Fisher of the 39th was in a rolling scissors with a MiG whose pilot was good, better than most of what Fisher had encountered in the previous 3 months, and was burning through his fuel and his options in roughly equal measure. Lieutenant Cecil Foster found a MiG-15 in a shallow dive heading northwest and put 400 rounds into it from behind at 600 yards before the pilot ejected. Captain Dolphin Overton, McConnell's wingman for the morning, had gone vertical with a MiG that had tried to climb above the engagement, found it hanging at the top of its arc with its speed almost gone, and fired into its belly at 400 yards with the sun at his back, and the reticle locked and steady. 9 minutes. 3 MiGs confirmed, 6 more engaged, 12 parachutes noted in the after-action summaries by 2 different pilots who had altitude enough to watch the sky below them for the 30 seconds it took to count. The engagements that followed were not all clean. Fisher's rolling scissors eventually resolved in his favor when the MiG's pilot bled his speed past the recovery margin and stalled at 24,000 feet, a fundamental error and one that the men who made it generally did not make twice. But Fisher came home with 31 rounds remaining in 2 of his 6 guns and a nick in his port wingtip that had gone through the leading edge skin and lodged in the internal structure. The MiG's 37mm had been working at extended range, and the round that arrived had been at the edge of its energy. 2 inches further inboard, and the spar would have taken the impact instead of the skin panel. Fisher knew this and chose not to record it in his after-action report in a form that would reach his wife before he did. By 11:27 in the morning, the engagement was over. The Chinese element that had held at 42,000 feet, the pilots who had been told to wait for clarity before committing, had watched the formations below them dissolve and had turned back north toward the Yalu rather than descend into the geometry that was eating their compatriots. This was correct procedure. The doctrine said disengage when the situation is unclear. The situation below 40,000 feet that morning had not been unclear. It had been catastrophic, and the pilots who held altitude and turned for home were following their instructions precisely and would live to fly again. The ones who had descended at the beginning, who had been caught in the burst when McConnell's first round struck the port fuselage of the trailing MiG and the formation went to pieces, had not had the benefit of the instruction's wisdom. They had had the engagement itself. The 51st Wing returned to Kimpo. Gun camera film was pulled from 11 aircraft and developed in the intelligence section. McConnell's 2 kills were confirmed by mid-afternoon. He had 13. He was now 1 behind Fernandez. The Soviet officers at Antung received their casualty reports in the hours that followed, assembled their intelligence summaries, and transmitted their assessments up the chain to Moscow. What the summaries recorded, in the dry accounting language of military aviation operations, was the outcome. Significant losses to Chinese formations in an engagement characterized by American energy conservation above the merge and effective use of close-range firing solutions. The Soviet pilots who had been in the formation and survived noted what the Chinese pilots had not, that the Sabres had not turned with them, had not accepted the invitation of the break, had not followed them into the climbing scissors where the MiG's rate of turn and its ceiling reserve were decisive, had instead held their airspeed through the initial chaos of the break and waited for the moment that the doctrine Bless had described was always going to generate, the moment when a pilot with insufficient training in an aircraft with declining energy made a turn that he could not sustain and exposed himself to the man who had been patient. The Antung assessment was honest in a way that institutional assessments sometimes are not. The losses were attributed to pilot quality differential to the specific engagement geometry that the American formations had imposed, and to a characteristic of the A1CM gun sight that the Corps' technical analysts had been monitoring since the first accounts of its effect arrived from Soviet fighter pilots who had survived close-range Sabre attacks. The gyroscopic sight was removing the calculation requirement from the firing solution. A pilot of average deflection shooting ability, with the sight stabilized and the range inside 800 yards, was producing kill probability figures that should have required a marksman. The MiG's cannon battery produced devastation when it hit. The question that the 64th Corps' analysts had been asking since the Sabres' arrival, and that the morning of the 2nd of April had sharpened to an urgent point, was whether hitting was achievable at the ranges and geometries where the Sabre pilots were fighting. The answer, in the assessment that went to Moscow, was that the MiG-15's 37mm was lethal at ranges up to 800 yards against a Sabre flying a predictable course. The problem was that the Sabres were not flying predictable courses. They were fighting in pairs, with a wingman available to attack any MiG that came off the initial target to pursue the lead, creating a geometry where engaging the lead element exposed the tail to the wingman and disengaging from the tail exposed the lead. Against Chinese pilots who could be instructed to hold altitude, the solution was to use altitude as sanctuary. Against the pilots of the 4th and 51st Wings flying the paired element doctrine through the spring of 1953, the solution was not yet clear. The MiG-15 remained the superior aircraft. The Corps would study the problem. McConnell killed his 14th MiG on the 12th of April and his 15th on the 16th. On the 18th, in an engagement above the Chongchon that his wingman would describe in detail for the rest of his life, McConnell's aircraft was struck by cannon fire from a MiG that came off a climbing break at a speed and angle that nobody on the American side had seen quite that cleanly executed before. The Soviet pilot, his identity has never been conclusively established in either American or declassified Soviet records, had held his energy through the first 90 degrees of his break in a way that should not have been possible given the geometry of the engagement's opening exchange, and had come back down a McConnell Sabre from an oblique high angle that the I1CM was not ideally positioned to compute. The 37mm round entered the Sabre's port engine bay. McConnell's J-47 lost thrust. He was at 21,000 feet, 50 miles south of the Yalu, and his aircraft was no longer an aircraft in any practical sense. He ejected. He came down in the Yellow Sea. A rescue helicopter out of Chodu Island reached him within 38 minutes. He was returned to Kimpo with mild hypothermia and cuts on his face from canopy fragments. He was in the briefing room the next morning before the duty officer arrived. He shot down his 16th MiG on the 18th of May, 1953. He was the leading American ace of the Korean War, a distinction he held until the armistice. He left Korea on rotation and was killed on the 25th of August, 1954, test flying an F-86 Foxtrot at Edwards Air Force Base when the aircraft entered an unrecoverable dive during a supersonic test run. He was 28 years old. The cause was attributed to control system failure at Hymock. The aircraft that had kept him alive over the Yalu could not be held responsible for what happened in the high desert of California on a morning without a single enemy aircraft in the sky. The armistice was signed on the 27th of July, 1953. The official accounting, released by 5th Air Force in the weeks following, listed 801 confirmed aerial kills against a loss of 78 F-86s in air-to-air combat, a ratio of 10 kills for every one lost that circulated through the world's air forces and defense establishments as evidence of an American technological and tactical superiority that bordered on absolute. The actual figure was different. Soviet and Chinese records, reviewed by American and Russian historians beginning in the 1990s following the collapse of the Soviet Union, produced a significantly lower kill count on both sides of the ledger. The number of MiG-15s confirmed destroyed by their own side's records was closer to 335. American losses in air-to-air combat, when American gun camera misidentifications and damage assessments were reviewed against Soviet and Chinese operational records, were somewhat higher than the official 78. The true kill ratio, the ratio that the actual documented losses on both sides supported, was somewhere between 2 to 1 and 3 to 1 in favor of the F-86. Not 10 to 1, but decisively positive, sustained over 3 years of combat against an aircraft that outperformed the Sabre on every specification sheet that circulated through both sides' intelligence channels. The specifications had not told the complete story. They rarely do. What had happened in the air above the Chongchon was this. The MiG-15 was faster in a sustained climb, could reach higher, and carried heavier armament. The F-86 had a better gun sight, better cockpit visibility through its clamshell canopy, and better hydraulically boosted control response at the speeds and altitudes where the doctrine Bless had codified forced the engagement to take place. Neither aircraft was superior in every envelope. The men who flew the Sabre had found the envelope where their aircraft's advantages were decisive and had, over 2 years of trial and blood and error, developed the discipline to fight exclusively within it. The men who flew the MiG had not yet developed a corresponding doctrine that negated what Bless had described, and many of the pilots rotated through the corridor lacked the experience to execute their own doctrine precisely when the geometry became difficult. The experienced Soviet veterans of the 64th Corps flew within their protocols carefully and produced results that the Corps' own analysts, in their post-war reviews, assessed as consistent with the aircraft's actual capabilities. The Chinese and North Korean pilots who flew against the Sabres without that experience paid the difference with their lives. The pilots who came home from MiG Alley carried with them something beyond their kill tallies. They carried a doctrine and the understanding of why it worked, and both were disseminated through the American fighter pilot community with a thoroughness that no gum law had been designed to produce. The Air Force Weapons School, built from the lessons of Korea and housed eventually at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, made the energy maneuverability framework the foundation of everything that followed. The instructors who taught there in the 1950s had been over the Yalu. The pilots who trained under them were the men who would fly over Vietnam, over the Gulf, over every subsequent air war that the United States conducted through the second half of the 20th century. The F-100 Super Sabre and the F-104 Starfighter and the F-4 Phantom all descended, in the specific sense of embodying the lessons their designers drew from Korea's air war, from what had been learned in the corridor between the Chongchon and the Yalu between 1950 and 1953. The Top Gun program, established by the Navy following the disappointing kill ratios over North Vietnam in the late 1960s, was itself a relearning of what Korea had generated, a recognition that the missile age had caused a generation of fighter pilots to stop training for the close-in fight that the engagement geometry of actual combat always seemed to produce, and a determination to rebuild the doctrine that Bless had first written in the margins of his operational notebook above. A landscape he would never be able to name publicly as long as the Cold War lasted. The Soviet pilots of the 64th Corps who came home from Korea came home to an Air Force that reviewed their experience with care and drew conclusions that shaped Soviet fighter development through the McCoy and Gurevich 21, the 23, and everything that followed. They did not return a hero's welcomes. Their participation in the war was not acknowledged publicly by the Soviet government until after 1991, and the men who had fought above the Yalu spent the intervening decades unable to tell their families or their country what they had done or what it had cost. Several of the highest-scoring Soviet aces of the conflict are honored today in Russia with memorials that do not specify where the kills they record were achieved. The MiG-15, whose pilot crossed the Yalu on the 1st of November 1950 and found nothing capable of stopping him, was not the end of the story. It was the opening of a question, and the question was answered over 3 years and several thousand engagements by the patient application of a principle that no specification sheet captures and no intelligence assessment fully models. That the pilot who holds his energy until the moment is right, who trusts his gun sight and his wingman and the doctrine that experience has verified, will prevail over the pilot who fights on instinct at the altitude and speed his aircraft prefers, even when that aircraft is, by every published measure, the superior machine. Bruce Hinton returned to the United States after his tour ended and continued flying in the Air Force for another decade. He never flew combat again. The MiG he had killed on the 17th of December, 1950, the first F-86 kill of the war, achieved by patience and positioning in the morning light above Sinu, was in all the ways that matter to the history of what followed, the proof of concept for everything that came after it. Jabara, who had gone into the formation on the 20th of May 1951 because the moment was available and the site was stable and the range was right, went home to Wichita, and came back for a second tour and added 9 more kills to his original 6. He died not over Korea, but in an automobile accident in Florida in 1966, at 40 years old, with 15 confirmed aerial victories in 2 wars and a gun sight whose mathematics he had trusted more completely than almost anyone else who flew in that sky. The sky above the Chongchon is empty now. The contrails have long since dispersed. The gun camera film sits in archives. The operational reports sit in boxes. The names of the Soviet pilots who flew in Chinese flight suits and whose kills were credited to an air force that did not exist are only now, 7 decades later, being properly attached to the men who earned them. What happened above MiG Alley between 1950 and 1953 was not a story about one aircraft defeating another. It was a story about the discipline to find the engagement where your aircraft's advantages were decisive and the patience to wait for the geometry that made your gun sight's mathematics apply. The pilots on both sides who mastered that discipline survived. The ones who fought on instinct and on confidence in a machine that was, by the numbers, the better aircraft, they were not always wrong. But they were sometimes wrong. And sometimes at 35,000 feet on a cold morning above the Chongchon River, sometimes was enough. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.